Now let's take a look at an example of developmental science in action. What I'm going to share with you is one study that came out of an entire program of research that we were doing at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center under the direction of Dr. Sally Rogers and Dr. Bruce Pennington through our grants with the collaborative programs for excellence in autism, where basically we were running a longitudinal study of the symptoms of autism between the ages of 2 and 11 years. I want to thank my colleagues, my mentor Sally Rogers, my colleague Doug Scambler, Mel Rutherford, and Beth Wehner, who all contributed significantly to our projects. So therefore, if a child has an autism spectrum disorder, it's thought to be there at birth. In fact, autism is strongly genetic. However, we don't have the medical technology to detect autism spectrum disorders yet. All we have are observational tools and parent interviews, and we are actually, as a field, much better at identifying autism at the age of 4 or older. But at the time of this program of research, we didn't have ways of identifying children younger than 4 years. Because of the power of early intervention, it became quite important to try to figure out, could we find ways to identify children with autism spectrum disorders earlier so that we could intervene earlier and hopefully see better outcomes. So this program of study came from some observations that a very experienced clinician, Dr. Sally Rogers, a psychologist and leader in the field internationally, really, for her work on the Early Start Denver model of autism intervention. She became curious about the possibility of emotional displays being a way to identify young children with autism earlier. So based on her clinical experience, she wondered, what if young children with ASD differ from other children, those who are typically developing, as well as those with other developmental delays, such as Down syndrome or other conditions? What if they differed in the area of emotion, in how much they shared their feelings with others? This is often referred to as emotional contagion, which does emerge typically in the first year of life. It's basically identified as when you smile at a baby, the baby smiles back. So Dr. Rogers wondered, gosh, could we look at emotional contagion as a way of identifying children with autism sooner? So her hypotheses were that young children with ASD will show significantly fewer attempts to share emotions, which is defined as directing their facial expressions towards others, than young children with typical development or those who have other developmental disorders. Now, it's really important to know if autism is specifically different in this way than another developmental disorder. That's going to be critical for our early identification. Her second hypothesis, what if young children with ASD don't catch the emotions of others? What we mean by this is that automatic matching display of another person's affect or emotion, particularly when they're in distress. We want to see if children with autism will pick up on the emotions of other people at the same rate and show this understanding at the same complexity as children in comparison groups. So the methods that we used were to conduct a series of experiments that allowed us to observe emotional behaviors of young children. We used some existing, already validated tools for this observational study. Something you may have heard of called the Ekman's emotion coding system allows us to identify the frequency of certain emotional displays, as well as how long it takes a child to organize that display and how long they actually display it. We also located a set of empathy tasks that have been validated on various samples. We recruited 3 groups of children. We needed 4-year-olds with ASD. The reason we need 4-year-olds, we had to be confident they had the diagnosis, and our technology at the time required tools that were only useful after the age of 4. We needed comparisons who were matched by mental age. In other words, where were they developmentally? We wanted them to be similar to our group with autism so that the specific difference we were looking at, that of emotion, would be different than just having an overall delay. So we had one comparison group, which were typically developing children, and it turns out because our 4-year-olds with autism were delayed, we needed to recruit 2 to 2.5-year-olds with typical development to match on mental age. And because it matters if children with autism are developing differently than those with other developmental delays, we recruited a third group, children with developmental disorders such as Down syndrome, who would match the children in our autism group both by mental age, how they were functioning, and by chronological age, how old they were. So we ended up with 3 groups in this observational study. In our design, we are basically comparing 3 groups of children on some developmental outcomes. So our independent variable is the diagnosis of the child, the group they are in. So although we didn't actually assign this to the children, such as you might assign children to an intervention, we can characterize our groups by demonstrating how differently they did on assessments of autism symptoms. So our independent variable is the diagnosis of the child. Our dependent variables, well, there were several, and in the paper that I've attached, we only cover a few. In the larger program of research, there were many. But here, our outcomes of interest came from our observational behavioral coding and included the number of times a child directed an emotional expression to an adult, and also the latency, or how long it took before the child caught on to the adult's emotions in a series of empathy tasks. So this is a cross-sectional design, as we have children in 3 groups recruited at the same time. The procedures for this study are outlined in much more detail in the publication I've put in Module 1 under Scambler et al. Basically, we had trained administrators who implemented a series of tasks that promote affect sharing and emotional contagion. What you'll see are knee bang and finger hurt, which are empathy tasks, where the examiner pretends to hurt herself and we see what the child does. And we also have a set of tasks called the surprise boxes, which I forgot to write on this slide. Surprise boxes are when the examiner opens up a box and pretends to either really like what she sees or to be really afraid of what she sees, and then hands the box to the child. What we are looking for is, do they catch on to that feeling of fear and apprehension that the examiner displayed half the time? And if so, does that stop them from opening the box? In other words, do they pick up on the emotion information, and then do they use it? We also have a surprise box condition where the examiner looks super happy to find what's in the box. We want to see if the children pick up on that emotion, and does it in fact increase the speed with which they explore the toy. We filmed all of these tasks, and a team of coders watched all the videos super carefully and went through a variety of procedures, which is described as establishing and maintaining reliability, so that we knew that having different observers still gave us data that was consistent over observers. Statisticians then analyzed the data to see if there were any group differences in the emotional behaviors. So what did we find? Well, before I tell you the actual scientific findings, let's take a look at this brief video that I will try to navigate and narrate for you. We're going to begin by looking at the surprise boxes in a 2-year-old typically developing child. So the examiner is sitting across the table, but you have a split screen here. You'll notice that the examiner shows a smile, and the 2-year-old boy picks up on that smile. He's looking right at her face and smiling and laughing, and he immediately explores the box. Now let's take a look at the surprise box condition where the examiner shows fear or apprehension. Do you see that? Do you see how quickly he catches on to that emotion? Sorry, that video is jumping. It's a bit old, but it's such a good example. That right there, he turns to look that his mom is in that direction. So that's a behavior we'll talk about later called social referencing. So that 2-year-old boy is using emotional information. Here's the same task, surprise boxes, this time with a 4-year-old girl who has Down syndrome. So she's delayed. She's functioning like a 2-year-old, but she's 4 years old chronologically. Notice how she appears to pick up on the emotion, but it doesn't stop her from opening the box. So we have a detection, very, very mild detection of the emotion, not a very clear one for negative. But watch what happens when the examiner shows positive affect. If the sound were good, you'd hear this child going, me, my turn, my turn. She apparently picked up on the affect, and in fact, look at this. She smiles to share, and what's in the box is actually a neutral object. So she has demonstrated emotional contagion. Now here's a slightly younger child with autism on the same task. What you'll notice, that's me almost 15, 20 years ago, trying to get this little boy's attention to me and to my face and to the box. I can't even get his attention enough to be able to share an affective cue. So this became a real challenge in our studies of emotional functioning in autism. We had to figure out ways to get their attention. And here's me trying nobly again to do it, hoping that if I increased what we would say the valence, the strength of my emotional response, would it change things? It did not. So here's a case where I show fear, and the child is not using that information. Could be a problem with his safety. But now let's look at empathy tasks, because these actually gave us a clearer set of data. The examiner is about to hit her knee on the table, and watch what the child does. That is a clear facial expression of concern. Not only is she saying sort of comforting words, but she checks out what happened. What was that evil table doing that it hurt her knee? And then when the examiner assures her she's okay, she nods her head and it goes on. Let's look at that same empathy task, well, actually a slightly different empathy task, with a typically developing 2-year-old. The examiner is going to pretend to hurt her finger with the xylophone. Look at the eyes of this typically developing child. Even before she's a verbal communicator, she gets it. She totally gets it. In fact, she's not quite 2 in this particular sample. So she picks up on what's going on. She's somewhat hesitant, but then she goes ahead and explores. Now let's take a look at this very same set of tasks with a 4-year-old boy with autism. As the examiner does the xylophone and hurts her finger, watch what he does. He looks at his own finger. He doesn't demonstrate any concern or contagion for her distress, but he catches on to what's going on and he looks at his own finger to make sure he's not hurt. This to me is a really powerful example of some of the social skills deficits that could be at the core of autism, where it's very difficult for children with autism to identify the thoughts and feelings of others and to separate them from their own experience. So that's a sample of the kinds of tasks that we did in the lab. And as you'll see when you look at the paper, we had a couple of findings from this set of studies. We found that children with autism were less likely to catch the emotion displayed by the examiner in either of the other 2 groups. And when they did catch the emotion, it took them longer to do it, and they also didn't always make decisions based on the emotional information that they had. They didn't use the emotional information to guide their behaviors. Either did 2-year-old typically developing children, by the way. It isn't until about 4 they did. So the publication of some of the findings from this study are in the Scambler et al. Paper, which we've loaded in Module 1. I thought you might want to just take a quick scan at that. I'm not going to ask you any test questions about it. I just want you to have a sense of how science happens in action, and it's a solid paper for seeing the level of detail that you need to present. In particular, see what you think of the discussion section and the limitations and future directions. The implications of this particular study is that we started to get some partial confirmation of our hypotheses that young children with autism don't display as much emotional contagion as expected by age 4. However, this study wasn't enough to say that emotional contagion would be the way to earlier diagnosis. In order to really make a convincing case, we needed to see if children with autism showed delays at the age of 1 to 2 years in these emotional areas. However, as I mentioned, at that time we didn't know how to identify autism in a 1 or a 2-year-old. We're still not very good at it, but then we really didn't know how to do it. So how can we test a hypothesis about the development of autism in a child who's too young to know if they have autism? Well, this is where genetics and heritability come into play. It turns out autism has a very high heritability factor, which means that the odds are much greater that a sibling of a child with autism will have an autism spectrum disorder, or at least parts of the spectrum. Therefore, what scientists did to be able to try to come up with better tools for earlier identification is that around the world they enrolled infant siblings of children who were known to have autism. So say there's a family with a 6-year-old boy with autism, and the mother becomes pregnant, is going to have a baby. They would enroll that mother in the study, and they would study that infant sibling's social, communication, and emotional behaviors over time, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, etc. So by studying the younger brothers and sisters, you're going to have about 20% of them will actually turn out to have some autism symptoms. Therefore, you over-recruit. You study children when they're old enough to see if you can find out if they have autism around the age of 4. You then can classify those children into siblings who develop autism, siblings who do not develop autism. And then you can go back and look to see what the early markers of that later presentation were. And it's this kind of work that is allowing the field to figure out how to identify autism in 12-month-olds and older. So if you're interested in this kind of work, there's a very strong paper, Sally Ozonoff et al. In 2010, which I've also attached to Module 1. Or you could put into Google Scholar the search terms Baby Sibling Consortium, and that will allow you to see how an international network of researchers all collaborated to try to figure out how to identify autism earlier. At this point in 2020, those of us who diagnose autism on a regular basis feel pretty confident that we can do it at approximately age 14 months and older. Some who are particularly good at infancy can tentatively identify 1-year-olds at risk. We usually feel most confident around the age of 2.5 or older, but work like this over the past 15 years has enabled us to improve our early identification and get more children into early intervention. So I hope that's been a helpful example of how developmental science works in the real world. Thank you for your time and attention.